What if David and Goliath is not about a weak underdog defeating a stronger opponent, but it's about a completely different idea of what power looks like? I'm Pastor Nate. This is another episode of the Sunday School Remix. Today we're talking about David and Goliath. You might know this story from Sunday schools of past. You can find it in 1 Samuel chapter 17, primarily. Here we go. Welcome to the Sunday School Remix, the show where we take Bible stories you learned as a kid and look at them with fresh eyes. Each week, we dig into the context and the overlooked details, and we often discover interpretations we never heard growing up. This isn't about winning arguments, but simply hearing God's living word speak to our lives again today. So grab your Bible and put aside your assumptions, and let's dive into another episode of the Sunday School Remix. So you know this story, and this one gets used. It's a part of our popular vernacular. Oh, the David defeating the Goliath. It's the underdog story, and that's how it often gets framed, is that it's just this, incredible story of courage and being yourself, and how even the smallest little boy with his slingshot can defeat the great Goliath giant if you have enough faith. That's very often how this story gets interpreted. But it's funny because it's about a whole bunch more going on in Israel at that time. You see, the way that it goes is Goliath was this giant from the Philistine army. And Goliath comes along, and the two armies, the Israelites and the Philistines, are on different parts of the same hill. There's kind of like a valley in between. And so every day, for 40 days, because it's the Bible and 40 appears a lot, Goliath shows up, and apparently he is about 9 feet tall, allegedly, and he says that someone has to come and fight him, and whoever wins the fight, then the battle's over. And so it's this weird psychological trick that Goliath is playing, and in a lot of ways, the Philistines win for 40 days. The giant keeps showing up and issuing the same challenge, and no one confronts him on the challenge because they're all afraid of this massive, clearly very strong warrior. They don't know what to do. What's really telling, the important detail that we never get to in Sunday school, is we never ask the question, like, wait, who was the king at that point in time? Who was the king of Israel? At that point in time, Israel had its very first king, Saul. For years and years before this, the Israelites wanted a king. And God's like, no, like, I'm your king. You don't need a king like every other nation. They're like, no, like, please, like, just give us a king. And it was this whole negotiation. And first there's judges, which was kind of close, but they're still like, no, we really want a king. And finally, God relents and gives them Saul. And so Saul is the first king. And one of the things that we're told about Saul in chapter 9 of 1 Samuel is that he was a young man and he was very handsome. He was the most handsome boy in all of Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. And that little detail seems really interesting when you think about the context of Goliath's challenge to Israel. So he is greatly feared because of how tall he is. And he is challenging the country, the Israelites, to a one-on-one battle. It would make sense that the king and that the tallest one in their army would be the individual to go and have this fight. But Saul's afraid, and Saul's not going to have this fight. And this story, you see, is trying to show us the ways that Saul is a failure as a king. And subsequently, the ways that, at least at first, David will be a much better king, more of the type of king that God hopes for. And all throughout the story, David is constantly talking about his trust in God and how that is the key ingredient that will help him in this battle with Goliath. All right, so there's a lot of little pieces going on here as the setup. It's not just a battle between David and Goliath. It's also really a story of God trying to give Israel the type of king God hopes they might have. And it's this confluence, this hitting of our understanding of what power looks like and God's hope for how a king will rule, God's hope for how power will actually be manifest. It's not through the large, powerful, well-armored warrior Goliath. It is through very different means. I'm getting ahead of myself. There's more of that to come. But so anyways, right, people are constantly looking outwards at appearance. That's where their fear comes from when they see Goliath. Goliath doesn't do anything to hurt them other than show up at the top of that hill and make the pronouncement every day. But that is enough to psychologically defeat Israel and make them worried. But this is part of the theme of the story, is that if we set our minds on earthly standards, we will constantly be subject to fear and intimidation. But God has another way of doing things. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 16, it says, people look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And this is kind of the setup for the Goliath story. As we're starting to get introduced to God's different way of leading, we hear that, and then we hear the story of Goliath. And so this ritual takes place. This is kind of where the story begins. At the beginning of 1 Samuel 17, it's the ritual of fear that Goliath established, the ritual of intimidation, of showing up and offering his challenge, and no one being willing to take him up on the offer, not even Saul, who seems like the logical choice. But then what happens is David enters the story. And the way he enters the story is so neat. Because in verse 12 is kind of where he shows up. David, comes to the battlefield and he's carrying supplies. He just went to the grocery store. But yeah, his father sends him with roasted grain and bread and cheese. And so he's got all these groceries with him. And that's when he hears Goliath's challenge. And what's unique about David is that he interprets the challenge in a different way. David, the Israelites hear Goliath's challenge and they retreat, but David hears the challenge and he starts asking questions. Everyone agrees what Goliath looks like, but David wonders about what Goliath means. And in so many ways, this story of David and Goliath really is about faith. But not in that sense, or not only in the sense of, yes, with faith you can move mountains, but with faith we have a different mindset. We see reality in a different way. We believe different things to be true than maybe just what meets the eye. And that's what makes David unique, is he looks at this giant and he isn't immediately intimidated and fearful, but right? He refuses to let the visible power tell the entire story. And so what happens is that David then, goes and tries to talk to Saul about this. He's like, hey, I want to fight him. Let me do it. And Saul's like, no, you're not able. Because Saul kind of knew David. David was sort of an assistant in battle for Saul at different points in time. But also David was one of the youngest sons of Jesse, and he was just this small little shepherd. But what David does when Saul turns him down is David tells stories. And he tells stories about how, as a shepherd, he's had to fight bears and he's had to fight lions to protect his sheep. And I mean, that's cool. I wish I had a story like that. But really what he's doing here, too, is he's trying to help Saul see, I have faith that God will see me through this. His faith is not confidence that nothing bad can happen, because bad stuff has happened. He fought a bear. But he has a memory of the ways that God has delivered him and saw him through difficult moments. And so that faith is what he'll bring into this battle. He's not going to be intimidated or fall victim to the psychological ritual that Goliath has put into place. And that's the distinguishing factor. See, this is kind of the message of the story itself, too. It's where do we put our trust and our faith? Is it just in physical displays of power and authority? Is that what convinces us and what guides our life? Because if that's all that we put our trust in, eventually someone bigger and stronger will come along and we'll be left totally afraid. You see, zoom out and think about this in terms of the Israelite story. They wanted a king so badly because everyone else has a king. Like, we need a king. And so they find the most handsome and the tallest boy in the entire village. And they're like, Saul, you're going to be the king. And Goliath is a story of how that fell short. Suddenly someone came along who was taller and stronger. And so they were left just completely paralyzed by the fear of it all. And God is saying, I hope, Israel, for you to see the world differently and to realize that because of your relationship with me, because I am your God, you don't have to play by the world's standards or become victim to the world's standards. That's also why God didn't want to give them a king for so long. It's like God's like, no, like, I'm your king. Come on. Right? Why are we playing by these earthly standards? It's a constant bickering between God and the Israelite people. Anyways, back to the story itself. When David shows up to battle Goliath, I mean, Saul gives him his armor, and David's like, this doesn't work, right? Like, I am too small for all of your armor, Saul. And it's a very symbolic moment in light of all the other pieces I've been telling you here. David has to take off Saul's armor, right? David has to put aside Saul's way of doing things because that's not God's hope. And so then David enters the battlefield, and all that he has is his shepherd's staff and 5 stones and his sling. And what's really interesting is Goliath starts by insulting David. He says, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? The only thing that Goliath notices is David's staff. He doesn't even see or acknowledge the slingshot that will be his downfall. It's kind of illustrating too, the ways that our power can blind us from the actual threats at hand. Right? We assume that this battle will be fought in one particular way. And that's what Goliath wants too. Goliath wants David to come close for hand-to-hand combat. He even says later on, he says, come here, because he has all this armor and he has this sword. And David from the start knew that he was going to use his slingshot, which really was a very, potent weapon at that point in time in technological advancement. And David's plan all along was just not to fight the battle the way that Goliath wanted to fight it. And you can see how that is also metaphorical for what God is trying to tell us through this story as a whole too. Isn't it right? Like, hey, rather than constantly playing by the world's standards, we as people of faith are taught to see the world differently. Right? Like, fight the battles on a different plane, in a different way than what the enemy wants of you. Goliath wanted hand-to-hand combat, and David came with a slingshot that Goliath didn't even notice. And so, yeah, his fatal mistake is not that he's too strong, it's that he can't imagine strength taking a different form than his own. And so what's really interesting is that David rushes into the battle. He runs towards the battle, but not before making a little speech. And he first says, it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. This is the nice little bow that David's tying on the entire story that really illustrates why he's the perfect one for this, what God really hopes for out of a king of Israel, right? Someone who's going to put their trust in the Lord, not their own understanding, will, strength, impressiveness, ego. And so David, after saying this, rushes into the battle and quickly defeats Goliath. Goliath falls face down after the stone strikes him right in the middle of the forehead. face down kind of being this universal symbol of submission, of worship, of defeat. But then, here's the part they don't tell you in Sunday school. David rushes up and takes Saul's sword and decapitates him. That wasn't in VeggieTales. And it's to show that he's really won the battle, but it's also, right, that Goliath is defeated by his own sword. If you think that power and might is the only thing that can save you, that is exactly what will be your downfall in the end. We want a king who's tall and handsome until, oh shoot, a more tall person comes along who we're terrified of, and we cannot free ourselves. Yes. The trust is in the Lord. It needs to be a different understanding that carries us. And so after Goliath is defeated, then Israel, like the spell is broken, and they surge forward. The Philistines retreat. Right? David doesn't just kill the warrior, he breaks the imagination of the Israelites that had been holding them captive. He shows them a different way and a different understanding. That's been the story the whole time. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's because that theme shows up so many moments in this particular story. Once the tall Goliath has been defeated, they suddenly realize, like, oh my gosh, like, why were we so captive to this display of strength and power? We have God on our side. We know what is possible now. So anyways, there's a lot of thoughts on David and Goliath. It's a more complicated story, but it's really neat when you dig into those details, because it's not just that David defeats Goliath and, right, like, hey, the little guy can win. It's like, no. Like, God wants us and has always hoped that we will put our trust in something other than worldly power and might. And God is trying to show us, like, when you put your trust in those things, eventually it will always lead you to despair. Can we put our trust, our faith, in a promise and a power that's so much bigger than this ordinary human stuff we get so fixated on? So there you go. David and Goliath, another Sunday School Remix story. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new. And remember, as I always tell you, the story didn't end in Sunday school. Thanks for listening to another episode of Sunday School Remix. If you'd like more resources for your walk of faith, feel free to check out my church's website, bethany-denver.org, or you can download our mobile app by searching Bethany Connect in your phone's app store.